There's something deeply immoral with the anthropocentric construction of personhood in society today, where we have arbitrarily decided that personhood, agency, and rights essentially stop in the same line as humanity. We would suggest that this would need to expand for us to be able to be meaningfully good moral agents in society. So, what do we want to do about that? The first thing that I want to do is set up a few clear definitions. The first thing I want to discuss is what is a higher animal for the purposes of this debate. We would suggest that higher animals are animals with relatively high levels of intelligence. So this would mean being able to perceive themselves, have emotions, have greater cognitive awareness. Some examples of these might be dolphins and chimpanzees, right? As for the exact list, we'd be happy to have this determined by a panel of probably biologists or zoologists. The specifics we would suggest are not as essential to this debate than the broader principle discussion about personhood and legal representation. These are animals, generally speaking, though, that are able to perceive value outside of survival, and they are generally capable of abstract thought, self-recognition, and emotions. So what's a policy? Policy is very simple. These animals will be granted legal personhood. So that means that one, they will at minimum not be allowed to be property, which means that there'll be no further captivity of these animals for human purposes, such as testing or for zoos or for even consumption. The second thing is that major habitats will be set up as reserves where no person can buy or own this land. So this is essentially going to be publicly funded and going to continue to be land for them that will be free from human encroachment. The third thing is where necessary, we will allow legal custodians, which in many cases might be NGOs or environmental lawyers, to sue on behalf of these animals if any rights are infringed, right? Or if there's any gray area that applies. Now, since we have that set up, what am I going to discuss in this space? The first thing I'm going to discuss is where do we derive personhood and rights, and why does this extend to the types of animals we're discussing in this debate? The next thing I'm going to discuss is explain why reciprocity in and of itself is not a good barometer of how to ascribe personhood, because that's something the op might discuss. And lastly, I'm going to go through what the extraneous benefits of this will be to the animals. Firstly, let's go through where do we derive personhood and rights from? We would suggest that this comes, generally speaking, from sentience and levels of intelligence. So we would suggest that the ability to perceive yourself as an independent being in the world, or your own moral character, or your own person, gives you the sensations of freedom, curiosity, desires, and social connections that then extend to rights you can actualize, right? This is why we afford rights to human beings, right? It is because you are able to have desires, you're able to perceive yourself not just as something that needs to survive or strives to be alive, but someone with your own agency, with your own desires, with your own character, with your own traits as an individual being. That means that you as an individual deserve rights in this world, right? We would suggest this applies to things like dolphins, chimps, and other animals of greater intelligence. They share these same characteristics where they're able to form complex social systems, engage in complex relationships like cooperation with other animals, and use tools in their daily life in things like hunting, right? And we would suggest that as a consequence of this, they deserve rights along the lines of what we deserve, of what we afford people who have their own agency, right? We would suggest in the end of this argument that any creature that can perceive themselves as their own beings, create meaningful social connections beyond survival, should never be instrumentalized as property or livestock, right? And it is not just the ability to fight back legally, which means that we shouldn't do this. Clearly, that's not the case, because if that was the case, then we wouldn't be affording these rights to children. We wouldn't be affording these rights to, for example, the differently abled or the extremely elderly. It is the ability to perceive yourself as independent, and the ability to have your own personhood in and of itself that necessitates that we give you moral personhood as a moral agent. The next thing I want to go through is this, just very quickly, this idea that Op may say that the personhood, like the standard with which we give personhood, is reciprocity. So typically the claim is that we will only respect rights of moral agents that are respecting rights, because only then can you have a cohesive moral system. Now, let me explain why this is not true. This is untrue. we afford rights to people who are unconscious and in life support, for instance, right? Your rights don't dissipate the moment that you're unconscious and no longer able to reciprocate rights and are no longer able to actualize your decisions physically, right? We afford rights to children that don't have the cognitive development to understand conceptually what rights are or to respect rights without any supervision. Like many kids just don't understand what consent is, what that peer pressure is wrong. A lot of other things like this are wrong. So a lot of them don't understand that, but despite that, we still give them their own personhood. These all show that reciprocity is not a requirement for affording personhood, but agency in and of itself, the ability to make your own choices, the ability to construct your own cohesive thought independent of the environment and not just like a need for survival that grants you or should grant you personhood as a being. Now, what are the benefits that these animals will get? So firstly, I think it's greater mobility. While they won't have absolute mobility in either side, they won't have absolute mobility. Granting them a habitat that cannot be owned by or encroached on by people or impeded means that they will have comparatively more mobility than they do in the status quo, where a lot of them are used in facilities. A lot of elephants are raised in zoos. A lot of them chimps are used in research facilities. Of course, like in terms of the comparative mobility and freedom, we grant them significantly more. Secondly, is I think we have more freedom from objectification. So when you're no longer held up as property to be used as cattle or tools for research for human gain, that means you're significantly more respected as a moral agent in society or in the world at large. We would suggest that while these pursuits might be utile to the human population, one, it's unclear why human sensations and human actualization of agency is necessarily more important than the actualization of agency that exists with animals that are intelligent, for instance, dolphins or chimpanzees. It's unclear why categorically that is more important than the type of agency we're respecting on government side. But the second thing is that even if these things might be utile, so even if we assume that they are utile enough to justify that, that doesn't justify objectification of these animals in the same way that we don't use children for research just because they don't have fully developed like moral agency, they don't have fully developed like cognition, right? But the last thing I think is that in accordance with all of these things, it provides legal recourse, right? Personhood empowers NGOs, civil society, and interest groups to pursue legal action in favor or in defense of these animals in the same way that groups like this are able to do this with elderly people or children who cannot represent themselves and therefore often rely on similar interest groups. In the end of the day, what you need to take away from this speech is very simple, that animals have agency some animals, the animals we're talking about in this debate, have agency and have the ability to perceive value in their lives. And as a consequence of that, we need to grant them a degree of freedom and personhood that we have not currently granted them, right? And to not do that is to draw an incredibly morally problematic and arbitrary anthropocentric line that we shouldn't be doing in the first place. Very, very proud to propose.
There are 3 points of framing that I want to bring up before I move on to my substantives. The first thing I want to note is that the government case does not provide you a strong and compelling reason as to why the trade-off in this debate is completely principled or moral. I want to note that being able to affirm and provide personhood rights in a This House Would motion necessarily means you're going to have to find means and methods to enforce them. That means building conservatories, trying to enforce issues, even if it doesn't necessarily mean going to the extreme extent of giving them unlimited mobility, is still likely to receive a massive economic and social cost in terms of time, energy, and resources, which are necessarily zero sum when it comes to people. That is, any amount of time you spend enforcing government policy necessarily makes a trade-off of that time, energy, and resources not being spent on human cases and other people. The trade-off that government then needs to defend is not choosing between an animal. It's not trying to compare animals to children, but whether you're willing to sacrifice the lives of human beings for the lives of a dolphin, an orca, or an other animal, which I don't think they're able to provide. The second point of framing is that I believe that the metric of this debate ought to be human utilitarianism. That is, you need to judge this debate based on who is able to protect people and the lives of people the most for three reasons. The first one is that human suffering is necessarily more certain and far more likely. Note that the suffering that we face is guaranteed because we know and understand that we feel pain. We can understand that other people do this. There's a lot of documented research, primarily because we are a human-centric species, and necessarily because that's how we've designed the world to live in. Secondly, there are already tried and tested processes for improving human lives, like having legal systems, economic systems, as opposed to an unclear policy by the government case that they're not able to provide. And lastly, we argue that it is far more moral to spend these types of things because you have direct moral obligations to other people, which I will prove in my own arguments later. The first thing I want to deal with then is to respond to their many claims about the rights that animals have. The first thing they say is that the reason why these people deserve personhood is because these people are sentient, and these animals are sentient. They feel these types of things. They can create pain. The first thing I want to note is that this is not necessarily true. Yes, they can congregate in social groups. Yes, they're able to behave in a colony, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same level of pain receptors, or that they're capable of emotion, or that they necessarily need things like the right to movement and the like in order to live free and happy lives. Many octopi quite happily live in captivity situations quite fine. In many situations, these quote unquote sentient animals have unique and different situations that do not necessarily require the right to, for example, personhood. So it's not clear, and there's no real scientific reason as to why these types of things are true and on the side of government. And the reason why on our side of the debate, it's less likely for that to happen is the following. First is many of these animals are adapted to their own like economic niches and their own sides of living. So it's not clear to what extent that they're likely to have human-centric elements or needs of personhood because they're not specialized to a human environment, which is what our conception of personhood is, but rather to their own environments with which we can deal with other existing forms of legislation. Secondly, it's not clear to what extent this policy is necessarily like needed insofar as there are many attempts to create conservation efforts and protect them as well. Note that they need to defend the specific right of personhood above and beyond what is already happening in the status quo, and I don't think they were able to meaningfully do that. But the second thing I want to say in terms of response is a lot of these comparisons about like, if we don't give these rights to animals, we must be against giving them to PWDs and kids. There are two crucial differences that separate these two categories. The first one is the ability or the certainty that they have these emotions and feelings. Obviously, children will grow up into adults and have these feelings. And the rights for PWDs and people is that they're not necessarily disabled from having those experiences. So on that basis of sentience, they're still qualifying those traits in a way that disqualifies all other sentient animals. And secondly, the reason why, even if they're not necessarily conscious or have mental health issues, is because we cannot discount the possibility that they will recover and have these experiences in the future. Contrast that with the certainty or the possibility of ever fully discovering the rights of these animals, and you notice that the analogy that they try to paint between these two falls flat. That means that the claim that they make is by and large not relevant in the debate. Then I want to talk about utilitarianism, which is the main push of the opposition bench and why it ought to be the most important consideration. There's a lot of reasons for why human beings are likely to suffer immensely. Firstly, because of things like collective action problems and flaws in our decision-making calculi, which means that we're likely to make accidental mistakes like climate change and the like, which harm us. Secondly, there's a deliberate and guaranteed suffering as a consequence of things like selfishness, capitalism, which is manifested in many different like forms of biases and oppressive systems that we live in. And lastly, we have the ability, lastly, in terms of like natural events and threats and disasters. So all of those things are happening right now. Therefore, we're likely to suffer. Why do we have a moral obligation to save human beings over animals? Number one, because we're more proximate to human beings and we have more influence over them. It's not clear that we have the tools and the scientific capabilities to design like perfect biomes for people, and especially in consideration of things like COVID, economic collapses, inflation, it's not clear that we have the resources to do that. In a context where we have to face a zero-sum game of resources, time, and attention, we argue it is infinitely more moral to save individuals and people as opposed to saving animals. The second thing is exclusivity. It's not clear why, as I mentioned earlier, why any of the personhood benefits are exclusive to granting personhood as opposed to just generically offering anti-cruelty rights and safe passage rights for certain things. But the third thing I want to say is that many of the actions that they can take to quote unquote give personhood can necessarily make things worse for the animals. The reason for this claim is simple. Number one, when you give personhood to like certain animals or give them specific protection because you believe each and every member of that species is helpful, you're necessarily going to damage the environment and the effects on the biodiversity. So for instance, orcas, which were bred in captivity, or for instance, the non-whaling for specific types of orcas, created a massive influx of like wandering vagrants that decimated fishing populations and consequently reduced the number of food population for the entire orca species in that specific section of the ocean. So these types of things like that artificially and blindly try to give people personhood also creates negative effects on the ecosystems and the biodiversity that these types of things have. On a utilitarian level, this means that their own impacts are flip because they actually create more long-term harm and greater harm to people. And this also means that we win their metric, assuming but not conceding that it is the one that wins this debate. But other than that, I want to note that the massive life or the benefits that we're likely to give to people are massive and ought to be the main consideration of this debate. So for instance, even if we're not directly spending on food, etc., which is where the money is realistically likely to go, given that those are shortages, we still provide enough flexibility for these types of policies in the future. To conclude, the government policy that you are likely to run on that side of the house is number one, tokenistic, assuming that this is a principled issue, which is what they argued, which means that they lose that claim because they're not able to prove the impact and the mechanisms for how it happens. But if it is a battle where we assume that their policy is likely to happen, we argue that those resources are better used for people, and that is the more moral choice at the end of the day. Thanks.